Thank you, Cormac. Folks, visualise the Simon community's work to sustain people in homes of their own in Ireland today, or Bernardo's work empowering children and young people, or the work of the Special Olympics in enabling people to become athletes. Or think of the work of your local Alzheimer's support group or cancer care group, and then think of the countless other volunteer-led organisations, too many to mention, that we're all familiar with out there. Believe it or not, there are over 8,400 such non-profit volunteer-led organisations working in Ireland today, supporting individual and community well-being and enabling people to realise their potential and make a contribution to community life. These organisations are driven by a strong sense of justice, and they understand what people can achieve in their lives when they are supported to realise their potential. My name is Ivan Cooper, and I work for The Wheel, a membership-based organisation that supports not-for-profit and charitable organisations to do their work better. The organisations we are privileged to work with, and the people who work in them, have a strong sense of what's possible for people, a guiding vision, if you will, that drives them forward. They have a strong sense of how the well-being of people and communities they work with could and should be improved. They have a strong sense of both the components of well-being, what makes for fully realised people, and of the determinants of well-being, the conditions that enable or prevent people from realising their capabilities. And it will be important for us today to keep this key distinction in mind as we consider well-being more broadly. These volunteer-led social mission organisations also make up a large part of the social capital glue that holds our society together and provide places where people can voluntarily get involved in sustaining community life. All of this activity makes a very considerable contribution to maintaining people's well-being. But what is well-being? There's a lot of work currently going on, which we've already heard a little bit about there, in relation to developing more holistic measures of measuring social progress than GDP, and developing more comprehensive measures of what matters to people and how they feel about their lives is seen as playing an important part in this. But in making this shift away from GDP as the proxy for progress, we need to remember that nearly every explanation of why GDP is not a good enough measure of social progress starts by saying that it ignores the distribution of income. So if we think it's a good idea to shift our attention to well-being, we should give a central place to the distribution of individual well-being and not just shift our focus from aggregate income to aggregate well-being. That said, portraits of national well-being generally consist of a mix of both objective measures and subjective reports of how people feel about things. Objective measures used to build up a picture of well-being include economic performance, the condition of the environment, the level of equality, life expectancy, educational attainment, things that we're familiar with like that. Subjective measures of well-being include such things as the level of general happiness a person reports with their life, the feeling that their activities are worthwhile, or how satisfied they are with their family relationships. By way of example, in 2011 in England, the Office for National Statistics, or ONS, began a national debate asking people what matters to you. People felt that the things that mattered included health, good connections with friends and family, job satisfaction and adequate income to cover basic needs, the condition of the environment now and in the future, and having access to education and training. Good quality public services such as healthcare, education and public transport were considered important, as was community spirit, which was felt to be very important, but interestingly in the English case, lacking. The importance of democracy and having accountable, trustworthy politicians was also considered important. Running through all these factors was the commonly held view that there should be a greater sense of fairness and equality for the sake of national well-being. These priorities could be described as the general domains of well-being that matter to English people when asked, and the Office for National Statistics is engaged in developing a set of indicators to measure these domains of well-being. When developed, the ONS will integrate the resulting subjective well-being indicators with the measures, the so-called objective measures of economic performance, environmental sustainability, educational attainment, etc., and a new national measure of well-being is the intended result. Great, good information to base policy on in principle. But another word of caution is necessary at this point. It's not my purpose this morning to comprehensively critique the idea of well-being, but I am going to quote John Baker, my former lecturer from my days as a philosophy undergraduate in 1988 in UCD. Sorry, John. And John is now Professor Emeritus in Equality Studies in UCD. Quote, if we want to measure people's well-being, we may well have to measure both the components of well-being and the determinants of well-being. But we should be clear about the distinction between them, and I've already referenced that. The idea of domains of well-being fudges this important distinction. The distinction between well-being itself and the things that affect well-being is all the more important if we want to affect people's well-being, because it distinguishes causes and effect and enables us to take appropriate action. Unquote. So it's important that we understand that the whole purpose of measuring well-being is surely to identify what needs to be done to enable people to realise their full capabilities. And that means being clear about identifying the factors that are preventing people from realising their potential and committing doing something to removing those impediments. All of that said, and returning to the theme this morning of interpreting subjective well-being alongside objective inequality, what if it turns out that there's no correlation between movement in objective socioeconomic indicators and movement in measures of subjective well-being? What if increases in national income, life expectancy, level of educational attainment, household income, quality of housing, etc., do not result in increases in personal happiness or subjective well-being? On the other side of the coin, what if personal happiness or subjective well-being appears to remain largely unaffected by very significant falls in national income, large increases in unemployment, rapidly rising levels of poverty and deprivation? According to the World Happiness Report, which many people in the room may be familiar with, Ireland ranked 18th in the world in 2012 in terms of subjective well-being. Perhaps more surprisingly, the level of happiness has remained more or less unchanged between 2005 and 2012. This period has seen the Great Recession, big falls in GDP, severe cutbacks in social service expenditure, historically high unemployment rates, the return of mass immigration, increases in poverty rates and at risk of poverty rates, increases in personal taxation, falls in disposable income, etc., etc. And no directly proportionate effect on levels of subjective well-being apparent. A small decline, but not anything near as significant as one might have expected. Are we to conclude from that then, sure, everything's okay, the people don't seem to mind? What are we to make of this? Does this disconnect between happiness and increasing levels of deprivation and inequality of condition at best render the measurement of well-being irrelevant to policymaking? Or does it perhaps more insidiously suggest even that basing policy purely on people's self-reported happiness could further entrench existing inequalities? John Baker once again put this well in a recent paper on challenges for well-being in Northern Ireland when he noted that, quote, we have known for centuries that people tend to adapt their expectations to their circumstances, indeed that it is rational for them to do so. So we should expect that inequalities in people's subjectively reported well-being will be smaller than inequalities in the conditions of their lives. Clearly, we should not conclude from this that inequalities of condition aren't important. What we should conclude is that it is wrong to rely exclusively on subjectively reported well-being, unquote. So, how do we explain the apparent non-correlation then between levels of happiness and decline in living standards? Is it a manifestation of John's point that as a result of people tending to adapt their expectation to their circumstances, that even in the difficult times that we have had, people seem to accept their circumstances and, so to speak, settle for their lot, in the knowledge perhaps that things will come good again, as that seems to be the cultural norm around here? Because on a straightforward face value interpretation of the World Happiness Report findings in relation to subjective well-being, that appears to be what's happened. But if things don't come good, and they haven't come good for many people for a very long time now, how is it that they don't let it get them down? Which of the evidence is to believe they don't? So is people's apparent ability to remain happy simply that people adapt their expectations to their circumstances? Or is the ability to remain happy evidence that our system of social protection has indeed protected people from the worst effects of the crisis? Or is it evidence that our social infrastructure in health, disability services, education, although seriously degraded through cutbacks, has continued to function effectively enough? Or is it evidence that our system of supports for unemployed people is actually working, providing people with opportunities to experience work-related purpose in their lives? I have my doubts about that one. Or could it be that there is some kind of cultural protective factor at work? that has enabled us to cope with the very difficult period that many, but certainly not all people have been through. I have a thesis, as yet untested and stated for the first time here today, so I'm taking a risk that the academics amongst us will be appalled, and here it is. Does Irish culture imbue people with a learned helpfulness rather than a learned helplessness that we often hear about? ICI conducted some analysis of existing research which we will be publishing later this year in relation to this. The research sought to gather together facts to gauge the health of active citizenship in Ireland or the extent to which people participate in community life. A central finding from the research is that Ireland's people, when compared to our European and OECD peers, appear to have a very high level of general engagement and involvement in community and neighbourhood life and in voluntary activity generally. So, for example, the research found, and some of it is drawn on the World Happiness Report, that people feel close to others in the area where they live in Ireland, and despite the recent economic climate, those who say they feel left out of society dropped from 14% in 2003 to under 10% in 2012. People report having regular face-to-face contact with neighbours, and out of 37 OECD countries, Ireland has the second highest score for quality of support network, which means Irish people feel the quality of help available to them is amongst the highest in the world. Alongside Dutch people, Irish people participate more frequently in social activities than any other European country, including many of the Nordic states. More than a third of Irish youth, the highest number in Europe, are involved in local organisations and youth groups, representing the second highest figure in the EU. More than half of Ireland's young people are involved in a sports club, which is again the second highest figure in Europe. Half of Ireland's people aged 18 years or over are involved in unpaid voluntary work, compared to an EU average of less than 1/3. This is the third highest rate in Europe after Austria and Sweden, again putting Ireland among the Nordic countries. And 70% of Irish people have given to a charitable cause in the last 3 months, albeit down from 83% of people in 2008. And Ireland continues to rank amongst the most generous givers in the world. So my question is, to what extent do the very high levels of community engagement, the giving of time and money, the high level of contact with family and friends, the strong contact with neighbours, and the high levels of participation in sporting and cultural life contribute to maintaining our high levels of happiness and subjective well-being? And do they have something to do with the fact that we are amongst the world's greatest givers of time and money? The World Happiness Report notes that research studies indicate a powerful link between high subjective well-being and social behaviour, such as being a better friend, colleague, neighbour and citizen. It notes that individuals who report high subjective well-being give more to their communities, both time and money. Could it be that these dimensions of our social lives, where we are star performers in European terms, and in many instances in global terms, which keep us in contact with our peers and provide high levels of meaning in our lives, are in some way protective factors? And could it be that all these relate to some deep and profound sense of caring and giving that in some way characterises Irish culture at its best? Could it be that Irish people really do know what matters for a happy life? Or is it that we have adjusted our expectations to our circumstances? I think that there's an element of both at work explaining our happiness in the face of increasing inequality of condition. But even if Irish people do know what matters for a happy life, that certainly does not mean they no longer care about the policies being pursued by government, as the recent elections testify only too well. They just know when, where and at whom they should expend and target their negative energy, while remaining basically happy. So, to conclude, measuring subjective well-being can only be one part of a more comprehensive system of well-being indicators which should distinguish between measures of the components of well-being and measures of the determinants of well-being, providing a clear picture of how the factors that determine well-being are distributed in society, so policy can respond to deficits in the determining factors that impede people's ability to realise their potential. After all, surely the purpose of our state must be to enable all citizens to realise their potential. If not that, what, I ask? Finally, it is the responsibility of policymakers the world over to have a vision for what's possible for people. It's the responsibility of policymakers to know what's needed for all people to realise their capabilities. It's the responsibility of policymakers to understand and support people to achieve what's possible for themselves in the same way I'd argue that Simon understands it has a responsibility for homeless people, that Bernardo's understands it has a responsibility for children and young people, and that the Special Olympics understands it has a responsibility for potential athletes. We all have a responsibility to each other, is what I'm saying, and it's primarily through government policy and the actions of voluntary, social-led organisations and social mission organisations that we give expression to these responsibilities. What we need now is a widely shared and well-supported guiding vision of the type of society we want to become, a society where maximum well-being for all is the objective and where everyone can realise their capabilities. We need a coherent plan in relation to how we are going to get there step by step, and we need a set of well-being indicators that identify the factors that prevent people from realising their capabilities, indicators which will enable us to take the corrective action necessary to deliver our vision. We can do it if we want it enough, and my question is, do you want it? Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the extra time.